when someone describes St George's as the Summerhill of the state system in this period in the 1950s, I can only go, wow. So, Michael Newman.
Right, I thought I'd start off a bit earlier than Summerhill or St George's. I thought I'd start off with this picture. This is New Lanark and Robert Owen's school. And I thought I'd start off with this because there's a lot of issues, incredibly powerful issues, that St George's and Alexander Bloom raised. And I just wanted us to be aware that those issues, whenever we've had major issues to do with what our society is about, what is the individual and their relationship to society, then we've had people like Alexander Bloom, looking at the way our schools work. So Robert Owen, industrialist, he went up to Scotland. He helped, he set up a cotton mill with orphan children, as a lot of the workers were orphan children who were very, very young. And then he set up a school, and the school's values were, that's 1816. That it was called New Lanark. This picture here is of adults. Normally the map was actually controlled by children, and the map doesn't have any names on it. It just has the world and, well, part of the world, as you can see there. And the children would ask each other questions about the map. And when someone got it wrong, they would sit down and someone else would get up and ask the children questions. And it was a way the children learnt from each other. But Robert Owen believed that geography is a way of children learning that we construct ourselves. He had this image of the mechanism of the Industrial Revolution, and that human beings were partly self-constructed, and that if the children could only learn that if they came from different countries, then they might have different religions, they might have different faiths, they might have different ideas of the world around them, and it would be partly due to the way they were learnt and the people around them. So he wanted children through geography to learn about the fact that they were building themselves within their school. The playground was the most important part of his school. He said that the playground, at the front of the school, there should be a dry area for them to play, and the only rule was to learn to help each other to be happy. And that was the only rule of the playground, or as he wrote anyway. And he didn't employ teachers. He employed people specifically who would refuse to make children afraid. He wanted people who worked with children to love children. So he wanted an absence of fear, and he wanted adults who would deliberately act so that the children wouldn't have any fear. All of this links to St George's in terms of the values of Alexander Bloom. Literacy. He thought that the child should direct the learning, that he should question, the children would have lots of questions, the teacher should be guided, or the adult should be guided through teaching by the questions of the children. And that literacy should be seen to be one of the tools of learning. It shouldn't seem to be a compulsive thing that you impose on the child. The child should see the reason, as they learnt to read and write, that they were learning to read and write as a part of the learning of everything about them. He didn't think reading and writing should be imposed on the child. It was a need for the child to do, but it was a need that would help the child to learn, and that's how the child should learn. And as a result, he thought that there wouldn't be a problem if children didn't learn to read and write by the age of 6. So long as within their excitement of learning, they would be learning literacy as a part of that. And geography, I've just mentioned, he thought geography was about helping the children to look at their own identities and to see themselves and try and liberate themselves, in fact, from being told who they should be by their teachers, by their parents, by the minister. And this just brings me to the work I do in Tower Hamlets is global citizenship. My job is to work with schools in Tower Hamlets and throughout London, in fact, as part of a development education centre, to get the children to explore the world around them and to look at their identities as active global citizens. So the thing that I would like to see is I'd like to see the people who are here today, I'd like to see them with school children in Tower Hamlets, and the school children in Tower Hamlets learning about what schools should be like. And this is the quotes that Professor Fielding used. It's from HMI report 1948. The fact that this is the new form of secondary school, and it's what it can be like. And it's like, why didn't they ever get read and actually implemented? Why didn't secondary schools actually be defined as HMI said they should be defined within the vision of Alexander Bloom and St George's? the year after, because I'm from Summerhill, I'm going to link the two. A.S. Neal visited St George's, and A.S. Neal thought that A.S. Neal is the founder of Summerhill School. A.S. Neal visited St George's, and he thought St George's was the most any state school could do in terms of participation and democracy. So he was very, very impressed by what Alexander Bloom was doing. And this is just a report on Summerhill School in 1949, and it's saying that every educator should visit to see what is going on in terms of the experiment of children directing their own learning, of living in the community, of making decisions, of making the rules. So HMI in those 2 years, 49 48, was saying Summerhill, St George's in the East, these could be the futures, that we must learn from them. We didn't, but that's what they were saying. The thing that interests me to do with the book and the film is the title, To Sir with Love. And I read the book, I'd seen the film, I had no idea of Alexander Bloom. It was only in reading about the history of progressive education and then about education in East End that I actually come across Alexander Bloom and realised what an incredible school St George's was. Up to that point, I thought it had been the failing school with a teacher who was the great hero who turned these children's lives around. And it's fascinating that To Sir with Love, and To Sir, because there's a lovely newspaper article in which Alexander Bloom is being shown around the school by a journalist, and the journalist writes that the children come out to him. If they call him Sir, he tells them not to. He actually doesn't want them to call him Sir, because he thinks that's an artificial respect in terms of adult authority. So I think the very title of the book and the film actually raise these issues about what is the relationship between the adult and child, especially in a school, and in terms of authority, and the fact that E.R. Braithwaite sees it as a positive thing to be called Sir, whereas Alexander Bloom didn't. This is just another quote about Alexander from the HMI. It says the school is fortunate in the headmaster who had brought to his work a vision of what the 1944 Education Act intended in the secondary modern school. So it's not seeing it as a progressive school, but it's seeing it as a school that the 44 Act is actually meant to create. And this is HMI quote. Yeah? And the fact that they see that the school is a virile and vital community. Yeah, and they're talking about the community of the school. It would be great if we had such visionaries running our Ofsted and HMI now, in terms of people like Chris Woodhead or people like the present Chief Inspector of Schools. My talk is about how schools in Tower Hamlets are actually learning to do with Alexander Bloom and St George's. Can I say they're not really? I mean, my dream is that they will, and that they are, and we've organised some events, and Michael Fielding has spoken to children and teachers in the House of Commons who came from Tower Hamlets and other London schools. And we're hoping that, because my vision is that the children in Tower Hamlets should actually learn about St George's in the East and what democratic cooperative schools can be like, so they can change their schools. That's what I would like to see, that the children, when they were asked about building schools for the future and about all the projects that are going on for changing our schools now, that the children will have a voice, and that voice will be directed by a knowledge of the history of their area and of the heroes of education, like Alexander Bloom, within the area. One of the remits that we do is about co-ops, and our present Minister for Children, DCSF, is a co-op MP, and there's a huge, at the moment, move about schools becoming cooperative schools and having cooperative ethoses, and they should reference St George's. They're not. And luckily I've been to a few conferences where I reference it, but even if you go to the co-op college or you go to anyone who's discussing cooperative schools, they don't reference St George's in the East, and they should do. What we do is we get children to interview politicians and businessmen and women about co-ops, and those interviews are then used as teaching materials for other children. So the children are creating stuff, they're learning, they're doing active research like they did in St George's in the East, and then they're sharing it with other children using technology. They get into groups and they interview. This is a guy who runs the cooperative development agency in Tower Hamlets. He's being interviewed by school children from Tower Hamlets, and then they're going to present to a conference what they found out about how co-ops work and why actually set up co-ops within the community. So learning about business. And then again about fair trade. The huge agenda in schools about being a fair trade school would be great if learning about fair trade, which is totally dependent on co-ops of farmers and things, the whole ethos is about business and social enterprise, is that if they were to think about their school and how do they make decisions in their school and reflect upon that in terms of co-ops. There's this talk about schools becoming co-ops or social enterprises. I think it's a very positive thing. I went to a conference, it was all as if it was about privatising schools. And it's like, no. And they had one of the directors of Serco, because he's really into schools as social enterprises. And the whole conference was organised by Social Enterprise London. And I was there saying, no, social enterprise is about schools controlling themselves. It's not about becoming private businesses. And so this is just another element in terms of what our schools, what I think our schools should look at in terms of the way they run, is that the school structure should be based on decision-making participation by, and I don't like the phrase, but by their stakeholders. And the stakeholders are the teachers and the children, and then possibly the parents. I tend to come from a Summerhill background, which doesn't involve the parents, but Alexander Bloom would involve the parents totally, I imagine. So, and then the children are treated as independent learners, that they can actually control and decide upon their education within the school. And if we want an agenda about social enterprise in public schools, that should be the agenda. And I think that agenda was addressed fully by Alexander Bloom, and we can learn from the model that he created. This is the frightening thing about everything that's going on in schools in Tower Hamlets is the language. This is what I have to deal with when I present to teachers and things. It's the young people's plan, and it's all about outcomes, and the vision's okay, I think. We want our children understanding differences, confident and courageous about the future, contributing to a strong community. What a wonderful vision. Yeah? And then it's got about how they do it, and I'm part of that. Part of the work I do is to try and do that. I won't read that bit though. But the objectives, increased participation, fine. I mean, participation is a very, very strange word. Yeah, because normally it's about adult-defined participation. I hate the word. I think rights and accountability. Giving children rights and accountability for themselves and the adults who deal with them would be a much better language there. But the whole, I mean, when I go to these meetings, I fail to engage with them in terms of their values, because they're talking about outcomes that are very important outcomes in terms of like not offending or reintegrating offenders and high quality and things like that. But they don't tend to talk in such a way that you can then link it with a school and think about, well, what does this mean in terms of individual children within the schools. And I think that our borough and all boroughs who are in charge of young people should actually have a debate about the values of what they do, instead of and defined by the values rather than the targets. We've got so many. At the moment, Tower Hamlets, the target is to radically increase the GCSE pass rate between A and C, and that's the target, and that's the mission statement. So anything that does that, they'll listen to. Yeah. So if you're at Alexander Bloom in school now, that's what you have to go to. You have to go and say, look, I can create more of my students getting A's to C's if we have a school council. If, yeah. It's not about having a community that's happy, healthy, and actually learning from each other. It's about a measurable outcome. And that's one of the things that totally threatens to destroy any move within any school to actually reflect the values of Alexander Bloom. Okay. I'll quickly go through yeah, okay. These are just some children. This child is looking at the American Constitution, and he's looking at what it reads and what a constitution is. This is a secondary school counsellor being interviewed by primary school kids about being a school counsellor. These are children being trained in the town hall about how decisions made by a school council could affect different parts of the community: teachers, parents, school counsellors, children, cleaners, and things. And they're being trained by secondary school children. So these are parts of my project where we're trying to get children to explore the issues about democratic decision making, about why make decisions, how to make decisions, and about those decisions relying upon constitutions and meetings. And how do you structure your meetings? How do you run them? What happens to the outcome? How do you know that that outcome has actually worked or not? They also interview the local politicians. And this is the secondary school kids running the session, and all the other children, primary school kids. And then what we've done is, because the thing is status. At the moment, A to C is status, certificates of status, stopping people getting into crime, it's status statistics. What I wanted was status for constitutions and what school councils do. So we've managed to persuade the mayor and the deputy mayor. This is in the mayor's office, and they're celebrating Nelson Mandela's birthday. But it's the same day they launched, as part of celebrating Nelson Mandela's birthday, this wall, which is the wall going from the mayor's office to the council chamber. And it's a wall simply for framed copies of school council constitutions. So as school councils in the borough, as a whole school, debate, should we have a school council? What should it do? How should it be structured? What should the voice be? How should that voice happen? And hopefully referencing examples like Summerhill and like St George's in the East, that the children can actually then create their own voice and define it, and not have it imposed upon them by a really enthusiastic progressive school council link teacher, but actually have it created by the children. And this is the aim of that wall, and this is what we're doing. And our next event, or one of our events, well, just before Christmas we had this. We had the school exploring this guy who in Warsaw ghetto had a democratic orphanage. And then this is the guy that they're going to see next, is Geoffrey Robertson QC, who's a human rights barrister and judge. And they'll be interviewing him about the importance of constitutions and human rights to the lives of our children and our adults. And that's what I would like to see. I want to see every school build up their own structures as given by Michael Fielding, and create them with meetings in democracy and their own voice.
Any questions?